Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chart Chat. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today, where it's more than just chit chat, it's Chart Chat. And we'll just do some quick introductions of the folks. We have a special guest, which we'll introduce in a minute here. But my name is Jeff Schaefer. I am the Stern Professor of Practice now at the University of Cincinnati, where I teach data visualization and descriptive analytics. And I also am the Vice President of IT and Analytics at Unifund, all based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Steve?
I am Steve Wexler, founder and principal of Data Revelations. My current job title is Professional Chart Looker-Atter. I am one of the 3 authors of the Big Book of Dashboards, along with Jeffrey and with Andy Cotgreave, and I am the author of The Big Picture, How to Use Data Visualization to Make Better Decisions Faster. And with that, let me hand it off to Andy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Cotgreave, as you hear, a co-author of Big Book of Dashboards, and I'm now a senior data evangelist at Tableau and Salesforce. Ooh, big change. Also, as of tomorrow, starting my 12th year working since I joined Tableau. So still going strong there. And really, that's me. Excited to be here with you all today. Over to Amanda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Makulec, joining from Washington, D.C. I'm the current executive director for the Data Visualization Society and am a health data visualization designer, speaker, and instructor. Back over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome, and I hope we have an exciting episode for you today. As we're going through, we encourage everybody to disagree with us, with our guest. Get some lively debate going. If it comes up, feel free to use the chat and continue that on in the after party if you're able. This is a slide of some people arguing over the table. I had to go back in the archives a couple episodes, maybe a year or two ago. I had to go back and find the 2 dogs, arguing over a donut chart. I just felt like that was much better to disagree. But I don't think Steve liked being called an old dog, so we got rid of that slide.
Well, just don't call me a senior person physician. I wanted to know, Andy, is that because higher status in the company or something, or your age?
It's because I'm getting old, Steve. Maybe
okay, there we go.
Wise, I like to say.
Most important is our special guest today, which we go back a long ways. The Chart Chat team with Cole. We actually published our book, thanks in part based on Cole introducing us to our publisher, Wiley, which is where she publishes her book. So I'm going to turn it over to Cole. Cole, could you introduce yourself to everybody?
Absolutely. Excited to be here. I'm Cole, and I'm CEO of Storytelling with Data. And I like to think of what we do as helping people and organizations create graphs that make sense and not just visualize the data, but go beyond that into how do you weave it into a story? How do you talk about it in ways that are going to make other people want to engage and listen? We do that through our workshops and our podcasts and our blog and our community and our YouTube channel, and of course, the books.
Yes, and the most recent book is Storytelling with You, which
yes.
Tell us about this, because this was fun.
Yeah, okay, so this is super exciting because it's all just literally coming together right now after what has been a tremendous and long enduring process. And so the pictures you see here are actually from, it's been 2, maybe 3 weeks ago now in Versailles, Kentucky, where I got to go to the Sheridan plant where Storytelling with You printed. And so you can see I signed a few of the pages, so those will be some fun surprises. The middle picture at the top, you can just see the speed with which paper flies through the printing press, which is a massive machine, by the way. It's the size of a city block and so many moving pieces. We actually did a video walking through the whole process, which you can find on our YouTube channel, which I thought was sort of fun. So as these, they're called signatures, so they are, I can grab one. I'm going to grab one.
Show and tell. We get live show and tell.
Yeah, so signatures, wasn't planning on this, but since we're looking at printing, are a collection of pages. So this is what prints on one plate. So it's 32 pages. And so here I've got one of those signatures where you can see it's a funny size, right? We've got some weird printing down at the bottom because it hasn't been cut yet. Because what happens is that massive paper goes through the printing press and then it gets printed both sides and folded. And then it's the folded piece that comes out in these 32-page signatures. And so you can't flip through it because we can kind of unfold to get to, and eventually you could line these all up and then you'd see the whole plate. And so it's some of the first signatures that were coming off the press for this specific run that I'm looking at the top right. There we're assessing color and crispness and looking for issues. We found a scratch at one point, which was super exciting because it was really like the stop the press. The bottom right, you can see the progression as the printing press is calibrating. So it's the same page pulled off, over the course of a minute or so from the press. And so you see it getting crisper. And what you see actually pictured there is an illustration from Catherine Madden, who illustrated this book. She also illustrated Let's Practice, but this shows contents of a presenter pack, which is something I recommend having on hand for anyone who is presenting. And then that's Bill on the left, our editor in common from Wiley.
Awesome.
Super fun to go to the press, by the way. And they said they rarely get authors there, but I have to imagine there's a different attention to detail that happens when I'm like peering over shoulders and peppering people with questions. And it was super fun.
It just sounds like geek heaven. I mean,
amazing.
I'm
well, and I've had
totally
many people say, "Wow, why didn't my publisher offer that?" And I don't think they do. But if you ask, they'll usually recognize it. Oh, that was great! I saw the comment come up about working there, and yeah, it's incredible. And the amount that is automated is fascinating. The amount that's not automated is also kind of crazy to watch. And actually, because of some of the relationships I formed when I was there, I got this, which is, I have the first 2 copies off of when the book got trimmed. So I was there on printing day where they did all of the different signatures. There are, I think it was 12 signatures, 6 forms to print the book. And then those all get put away in a different spot. And then on another day, the cover prints, and then everything gets put into an assembly line where one signature drops, then the next, then the next, then they slap the cover on it, and then it goes through the trimmer that actually cuts everything. And that's where you get a book that you can actually flip through, which is super fun.
Cool process. Well, that's exciting. I guess we should jump into our content. Our agenda for today is we're going to talk about 3 main topics: defining the audience. We're going to look at a short case study that Cole was kind enough to share. We all were able to preview the book, and there's a really interesting case study in there. And finish up maybe talking about developing communication skills and kind of the importance of that. So I guess to kick off defining the audience, I know Steve will have seen, he knows what's coming next. He knows the slide that comes after this. But in every workshop I teach, in every class, my students probably get tired of hearing and seeing these 3 slides. But from my perspective, I always say, who's your audience and what's your message? And so I just kick that off, I guess, and kick it over to Cole and talk about how defining the audience.
Absolutely. So in the new book, it's organized into 3 sections: plan, create, and deliver. And the plan section, the very first chapter there, is audience, because audience is really the foundation for everything else we do when we're communicating. So to not think about them would be a huge misstep, which makes sense when we think about it. But I think so often we don't pause to think about who's our audience, what are their needs, how do they want to be communicated to, and the line of questioning that can go on and on from there, because it's very easy for me to communicate for myself. It's a much harder thing to pause and really think critically about the people on the receiving end of what I'm building, whether that's a graph or a presentation deck or a dashboard, and try to put yourself into their perspective, right? What experiences do they have? How does that shape their view of the world and their view of data, if that's what you're communicating? Where are they? How do you meet them, both in terms of the appropriate level as well as just physically, right? Do you go to their office? Do you have them come and sit with you? Is it virtual? When we pause and think about our audience, it shifts things in a really interesting way, because no longer now are we creating the thing for ourselves or for our data or for the project we just finished. It puts a different framing on it where we're actually considering the other person and thinking about, how do I frame this not for me, but first and foremost for them? Because when you want someone to pay attention and engage and drive action with what you've done, that is going to be the best way to position your communication in order to do so. Which again is one of these things that sounds obvious when we say it, but I'd encourage everyone to take a look at the last thing you did, right? The last project you worked on, or the last slide you made, or graph or dashboard that you built. Did you think about your audience during that process? Because this simple step of just pausing and doing that for a moment or two will have impact. And when the stakes are high, spending much more time than that, considering who they are, trying to define that if you don't know specifically, thinking about how you can narrow the primary people within your audience that you are targeting. All of these things are going to help you be more successful ultimately, which is a ton of me talking, so I'll pause.
Well, lots of good questions and comments. What about the process of defining? Do you do persona mapping? What kind of tools do you use when you're doing that?
Yeah, you absolutely can do. It really depends on the scenario. And often it's useful to start by casting a broad net and then figuring out whether and how you might narrow from there. Because if we go narrow too fast, you may actually miss considering perspectives that would have been important or critical when it comes to the actual communication. But if you stop at the broad net and don't narrow, that has its own set of challenges, which is what we tend to do most often when we're not pausing to consider our audience. We put together something that's going to hopefully meet some needs of everybody, which typically means it's not going to meet the specific needs of anyone, which sometimes is okay. If it's a dashboard that really goes out across lots of different parts of the company and you have different people looking at it through different lenses and it's designed for that, that's fine. But if you have a specific audience or you need people to understand something in a new way or act differently than they are or that they have before, then you will run into some big challenges when you don't narrow. So if we get really practical and specific about how do you do that, I'd say start by making a list. List all the potential audiences who might be interested in the thing that you're working on. And that can be anything, right? A slide, a graph, a dashboard, a presentation, a website. List everybody first, or spend a few minutes brainstorming who might be interested. And then with that list, you can narrow in a couple of ways. And the ways that I typically frame it are narrow to now and narrow to the decision maker. So when it comes to narrowing to now, that's really thinking about what point in time am I at currently? Who needs to interact with this thing or learn something new from what I'm communicating in the near term? Because oftentimes when we put together these big lists of audience, it's audiences downstream who kind of can muddy our focus when it comes to the nearer term. And so by narrowing to now, oftentimes we can rule out big groups of audiences as not being immediate priorities, which helps narrow. The other way, once you've narrowed to the present point in time or the near term, is thinking about, is there a decision maker or a group of decision makers in that group, in the mix of audiences whom I'm communicating to? And it doesn't mean you only communicate to them, but it's a way, again, of prioritizing how you're spending both your energy when it comes to planning and then your time putting together and preparing materials for that highest priority group. And Jeff, you asked about persona mapping, and I think certainly in large mixed audiences where you need to communicate to everyone simultaneously. Right? So examples of this would be, maybe it's a large steering committee at work or a conference presentation or, something like what we're doing today, where we know we have people joining from all sorts of different spaces. Then to make sure you're meeting your audience's needs and really just to force that pausing and thinking about them, you can make profiles or kind of map these personas where, you might have a group of people who have a certain set of preferences or who are driven by specific things. And doing that sort of mapping and grouping people can help make it so you're not just throwing your hands up in the air saying, I have a mixed audience, I can't deal with this, and force you again out of your own head and out of your own perspective to be thinking about how what you create might be received by someone else, and then subsequently doing things intentionally to make that a good experience. And that's really what it comes down to. When you want to communicate effectively, think about the person on the other side of that. And this is in everyday scenarios, right? The next conversation you have with another human being, it's in meetings, it's in presentations. How do you make that an enjoyable and educational, if it makes sense, or inspiring if needed, experience for the other person? I think if more people could do that, the world would be a better place. And we'd for sure have better meetings.
Andy, Steve, Amanda?
Yeah, I was going to say there's some incredible comments flowing through the comments. So I'm really enjoying seeing what people are saying. I mean, I'll just say narrow to now and narrow to the decision maker. I mean, that's, as you say, that's good generic advice. But I was thinking, well, the dashboard designers should be thinking about that as well. But we saw the one from HClap219, the hardest part is getting steeped in data, forgetting that the audience doesn't have the same familiarity or vocabulary that we do. I know you touch on chart choice, for example, if you're presenting data in charts, and it's always tempting to be like, here's my really exciting Sankey diagram showing flow of blah, 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 blah.
Well, so this is a great point, and is actually there's an easy thing you can do when you can anticipate that to be the case. You can almost always anticipate that to be the case, right? That you speak in a language that is different from people on the receiving end of that in some way, right? Because your experiences, the tacit knowledge in your head, all of these things are unique to you. And so the more we can do to get outside of our head and imagine things or see things from another perspective. And an easy way to do this, we do this very frequently in workshops, is grab somebody who doesn't know what you're going to be talking about, who is unfamiliar, and explain it to them and let them ask questions as you do. And we'll often do this with a specific concept called the big idea, which is where you've got your point so specific that you can say it in a sentence, which there's actually an entire chapter. It's chapter 2. That's the next part of the foundation in the new book for those who want more. But the idea is you get things down to a level that's concise, but still specific, not overgeneralizing. And then you say that to someone else who's not familiar. And just the conversation that ensues from there in terms of specialized language that might not be universally known. You're using more complex ways or complicated ways of saying things that are needed because talking to someone else, they have a different vocabulary in some way that can be useful. And that process of explaining and the question and answering that someone can do who is fully unfamiliar with your work, it will help you assess where you might be overcomplicating or where you might be using specialized language. And so then you can say, okay, now how do I refine to make that work given my audience? So you imagine the spectrum of familiarity with what you're going to communicate. You are at one end of that, right? Or the dashboard you're communicating, whatever the thing is, and your audience is at the other end, right? You are intimately familiar with what you're going to communicate. Your audience, or excuse me, not your audience, your partner who you're talking to, who has no context, is out over at the other end of that spectrum. And so your audience probably isn't over here, but they're also not in your head, right? And so by talking with someone where that gap is wide, then you can figure out, how do I narrow it based on what I know or what I can assume about my audience?
Sorry, Steve, I know you had your hand up. There's a really important concept there about giving people permission to give you specific kinds of feedback as well. Because what I found is people who are beginner speakers, it's sometimes hard to give feedback because you don't want to offend them or upset them or just put them off speakers. And people who are accomplished speakers, sometimes it's difficult to give them feedback. It's like, well, because you're an amazing speaker, so how could I say anything constructive? But if you say, I would like you to criticize, specifically define the kind of feedback you're looking for, and it opens the door to say certain aspects. So,
and I would broaden that, Andy, to say that is a good practice anytime you are soliciting feedback on anything you're doing, is to be clear about who you're asking for feedback and why that person or group of people makes sense, but then also what role you need them to play. And don't just think that for yourself, be explicit. The feedback I would find most useful is, do my words make sense? Am I speaking with sufficient clarity? Do you understand what I'm saying? Does my call to action make sense based on the details that I'm sharing? Am I making any assumptions that I might not be aware of? Are those assumptions likely to be right? And you can frame, the more you can frame what you need from someone else when they're giving you feedback, the better feedback you're going to get. And especially if you are facing constraints. Because if I need some quick hits for something that's due at the end of the day today versus I have weeks of time to tweak around the edges, the feedback that should look very different. And so to not give the person you're asking for feedback that context wastes a lot of time and energy.
great.
It's interesting. We actually include in our DVS has a critique channel. And one of the things we always ask for if someone's looking for feedback is, who's the audience that you're trying to serve? What are you trying to get across? Where are you in your design process? If this is an early prototype that has a lot of endless tweaking that can still happen, or are you looking for kind of final refinements? Because it's really cruel to go back in and say, can you go ahead and rework this entire product?
Yeah, start from scratch.
Yeah, start from scratch. The product, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say. Nope, go ahead, please.
Feedback online scares me, right? And we see how that goes awry on social media and other places. But I think even when people are trying to be kind, that doesn't always come across. And so I would also say for those, and particularly if it's a high stakes scenario, seek feedback where you can have a conversation with the person, because also the question and answering is super helpful there, because if there are constraints like this, then that can come up as part of the conversation, as opposed to you get feedback that's going to be irrelevant or disheartening based on what you're facing. So go live for feedback when you can.
I mean, I think
I spied something from Daniel Zabinka that he stated.
I saw his name come up in chat, but it went by too fast.
Audience or audiences. And what do you do when you have two or more clearly defined audiences? Do you try to create one presentation that's going to serve them all, or do you end up forking the code, so to speak?
Well, you know the answer to that, which is it depends. And a Venn diagram is useful here with when you're mapping audience needs, right? So if you have audience A and you have audience B, how big is that overlap? Where overlap is big, or even where it's sizable, even if not huge, then you might be able to get away with the same thing for both, because you've found enough overlap there that when you veer outside of that a little bit in this direction and outside of that a little bit in that direction, probably there's enough commonality to keep that part of your audience engaged. Where you run into trouble trying to do the same thing for different audiences is when those Venn diagrams have very little overlap, where the needs are sufficiently different. And when that is the case, you will typically be best served by just breaking things into two separate communications and optimizing them for the given audience. I mean, one great example actually of that, even not coming to audiences, is how you're going to present to them. If you will present to some people in your audience live, right? You're in the room, you're standing there physically with them. You're going to have a slide up on the screen, a presentation that you're running through. And you're going to give that same presentation to somebody in Flatland, right, virtually, that you're going to want to optimize for those two different things as well, because those are sufficiently different spaces where there are some tweaks around the edges. And they may not always be huge, but sometimes they might be. And just when you can optimize things for the given audience, for the given way in which you're presenting to them, it just makes everything else go smoother. It makes it easier to do a lot of the things that are hard. And they're not going to be easy as a result of this, but they will be easier when it comes to keeping people's attention and getting them to want to listen to you, bringing understanding to what you're presenting, whether it's data or anything, and then trying to drive them towards an action, hopefully. Because if we can't do that, then we want to revisit the need for all of this in the first place.
Galen had brought up a really interesting, I think, related point around the kind of product you're sharing. I mean, we're talking a lot about presentations and designing presentations for very different audiences, but I thought his point around like different groups getting different things, that if I'm handing someone an interactive dashboard, I'm presupposing some knowledge that they know what kind of questions they want to answer with that dashboard, and they want to dive into the data themselves in terms of that experience versus a presentation. And I know that there's also those kind of in-between spaces that are more report-like or slide docky or those kind of other mediums that are not just a presentation deck or a dashboard. Are there different ways in which, as you've thought through how you present and share and disseminate things, that you recommend to folks to make sure that people are getting kind of the fit for me way of engaging with the information from a medium perspective?
I mean, certainly if you can talk to the people in your audience and get that feedback directly is going to be the best way. But you can also use experience, right? So what do you need to have to happen as a result of your communication, right? And I keep saying communication or presentation, but you can substitute in dashboard or graph for almost all of this. Is it working, right? Is the thing that you need to have happen happening? Are people looking at the dashboard? Are they acting based on the presentation that you gave and the recommendation that you put at the end? Are people having the right sort of conversations and discussions around the decisions that are being made that you can observe over time and ask questions, right? If it's ever something you're throwing sort of over the fence, or you're a level removed or more from where the conversations are happening, if there's anything you can do to be a fly on the wall in those conversations, it's actually easier now, right? Because it's so easy to join a virtual meeting. So there may be potential for that today where there wasn't a few years ago even. Can you talk to people who are using it? Or talk to people who know people who are using it? And if you're unsure, do some of this proactively to try to find out, because it sure would be sad if you're spending a ton of time doing something that's not driving what you need. And so it could be that you're not aware of it, or it could be that it's not, or it could be that no, everything's just status quo and this isn't something where we need to do anything about it right now. That's also fine. But hopefully that stuff's automated so you don't have to look at it over and over again.
One of those spaces where all of those different user experience and UX principles are actually really helpful as a toolkit.
Absolutely.
Jeff, I know that we've been able to sit on audience for a long time, because I think we could talk about audience and audience mapping for just about forever.
It's good. We'll make the next section shorter, I guess. The next topic we wanted to talk about with you, Cole, was I guess the tricks case study, if you will, or the part of that in the deck. This came from, I guess you could probably describe it better, because I mean, this is a long process of the book. This isn't just a couple graphs that we're about to show. So maybe you want to set up what this is, and I can show the charts.
Absolutely. So there is a case study that I go to at the end of each of the 12 chapters of Storytelling with You. And it's the scenario is that I am a consultant going into a company called Nosh, and I'm trying to win their business going forward. And so we're doing this proof of concept pilot project that is around changing potentially the makeup of a popular trail mix that they carry or that they create. And so I go through the entire process from thinking about my audience really specifically to crafting the message and plotting out the different pieces that are going to support it and forming those into a story, right? That's all in the plan section. And then I go through the process of creating my content. So how do I build a skeleton for bringing the low-tech planning into PowerPoint in this case? You could do a similar thing in dashboard land, creating their chapters entirely on creating words, creating graphs and images for use in slides and presentations. And then, so in each of these, I'm going back to the case study and showing how I create and integrate this sort of content to make materials that are going to support that final important business meeting. And then in the deliver section, I share my process, and I literally did this and recorded it as I was so I could be as true to what it really looks like as possible. But when it comes to refining through practice, building confidence, introducing myself, there's an entire chapter devoted to that, and then ultimately giving the presentation. And so the tricks case study is this case study that I go back to every single chapter to show how does this play out in real life, in a real scenario. This is a real scenario. It's just been modified and generalized, and the details moved around a bit to anonymize it for use here. But then the real fun thing that I'll mention just before we look at a couple images from it is we recorded the ultimate presentation at the end of that. And so we'll actually be airing that on September 22nd. And so invite everybody to join. You'll find that info at storytellingwithyou.com/finale.
Awesome.
So what we're looking at here are some graphs from chapter 7, which is focused on showing data in graphs. And there's actually a step that comes even before here where it starts out as a table. And so part of the process is just figuring out, okay, out of all of this data, what do I actually want to show? And where is it going to come into play? And how do I make visuals that are really going to support my spoken word and not distract or overwhelm? And so I go through a transition starting with the top left. Here's your standard bar chart. Right? This is what PowerPoint in this case spit out when I put some data in it that I had decided I wanted to put into a graph. And so the first thing I want to do is figure out where do I want people to focus within this. And at this point in the case study, I'm focusing on the, well, actually, no, I take that back. It's not the original blend. Up here, we're overall. So we're looking at, these are liking scores from the taste tests that we ran. And so you notice on the top left, your eye is not directed anywhere specifically. Everything's sort of crying out in equal measure in terms of look here, look here, look here, which means you're left to process all of this to try to figure out what's going on. So we can focus attention, also get rid of some clutter, and then we see what that can turn into on the top right. I'll just point out also the takeaway title at the top of that slide. The original is preferred overall. So I prime my audience what they're meant to see. And then the overall dimension is what you see highlighted in blue, with even within that, then the original mix in the darkest blue in first position and darker and bolder than the rest to direct attention. So these are minor things to do to make it clear to my audience where I want them to look and what I want them to see. I didn't stop there, though. I could have. This would have worked reasonably well to get across what I wanted, but this wasn't a sole graph that I was using to communicate. This was part of a broader story. And so I knew that eventually I wanted to build up to a dot plot, but I didn't want to start there because my audience may not be familiar with this type of graph. So instead, I started with the bar chart. Here, I've flipped it on its side just so it'll be in the right structure for the eventual dot plot. What we see at the top on the x-axis is a 9-point liking scale. It's called a hedonic scale, ranging from dislike extremely at the left to like extremely at the right. We see our original at 8.1, scoring higher than the alternatives. And then we see on the bottom right, now I'm just replacing those bars with circles. And actually here, I'll overtake you for a moment, Jeff, so that I can show. I don't know if we can pin that to make it big, but
yep. Oh,
no. That's fine like that. We don't need to see the super tiny details. Oh, here we go. So if I'm doing this live, it works particularly well because you can actually animate things come on one at a time. And now in this transition, we can actually see the circles take over the ends of the bars. My reason for doing that here is so I can collapse them onto a single line and then add some other dimensions. And that's as far as I'm going to take it because I'll talk through this in context of the broader case study and show all of the rest of the transitions and goodness that go along with weaving the data into a story in that session that I mentioned before on September 22nd. That'll be at noon Eastern on our YouTube channel or LinkedIn or anywhere you can watch stuff like that, stuff like this.
I just wrote down 15 things that I saw you change between the first and the final chart, and I'm sure I didn't even get half of them. It's it's always really interesting seeing that iteration and seeing how you go from the process to like, well, this is the default, and actually it's not really very good. It's just not appropriate for what the message is you're trying to craft. So I like it.
It's interesting, right? Because this is one thing that has become increasingly apparent to me in the past decade plus that I've spent talking to people about graphs and teaching people how to think about design and communicating when they're using data, is that even after all of that, the graph is just one piece of it, right? And I mentioned it, that first iteration, maybe not the default graph, but that first iteration after that I showed would work reasonably well, depending on how I play into that equation. And that's the thing that's become increasingly apparent to me, is just the role that the individual plays when it comes to communicating and when it comes to whether or not that is a successful scenario, which is crazy when you step back and think of it, because that says things like two people who do the same great work where one can speak about that in a way that makes other people want to listen and engage, and the other one maybe struggles or hasn't spent time developing those skills, one of those is going to be more successful in getting done what they need to. Yeah. And so we do ourselves a disservice. And I think this is a place where, and I will put myself squarely into this group, where you're drawn towards the technical side of things. You've developed quant skills. You like sitting behind your computer and making graphs or dashboards, right? We're drawn to those sorts of things for a reason. And that makes it really easy to invest in our technical skills, right? We learn a new tool or a new coding language or a new fancy graph that we're going to start using. That's more comfortable. The thing oftentimes that is less comfortable, that is going to serve you even more, is going to be investing in some of those other skills that maybe you didn't pay a lot of attention to formally, right? I think back to my own education of, I was studying math and I was doing science, and taking a communications course in the business school was not something that was squarely on my radar. However, the more you can, it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be traditional learning, and probably can be that even less than technical sorts of fields, meaning you can learn so much experientially and in the workplace. And the more we think about how might we use opportunities that are there, that exist around us, to sharpen how we speak about our work, how we interact interpersonally with others, that is going to be critical. And I think especially because skills are, and technical skills have really grown at large in the past decade, I'll say. Right? Data scientist is a sexy career, which never used to be the case, right? Statistician was never as popular. But the way to differentiate is going to be in how you can communicate. And it's always driven me crazy that historically that's been characterized as a soft skill, because you can be incredibly strategic when it comes to how you speak about your work and how you speak to communicate anything to others.
Yeah, this is my favorite tweet from Alberto Cairo, 2018. If you're using this cliche soft skill, let's talk about communication. You have no clue about them. And
I have no problem with that term at all, because it is hard to measure and quantify. I have a problem with thinking somehow that it is not worthy of attention. It's incredibly important. Ronald Reagan got elected because he was the great communicator. So, but I have zero problem with the term soft skill. I have a problem with someone thinking there's a problem with the term.
I think one of the reasons it's problematic is certainly in the UK in the last sort of 10, 15 years, education curricula have been focused on STEM skills. We need science because they're the skills we need for a successful workforce in the future. And of course, you go, well, where are the people who can think? Where are the people who can empathize? Where are the people who can be creative with ideas? Oh, no, they're just soft skills. We've killed those from our curriculum, and now we've just got a bunch of scientists. So,
can I interject?
Yes, please do.
I don't care what we call them, but can we get better at it? Yes, we can.
Yes.
And there are specific ways to do so. And so for me, just going back to, I'd mentioned the graphs that we looked at before, right? If I can talk through any of those views, even the first one, if I'm a really good speaker. We've all seen that before, where a speaker can engage us and it doesn't even matter so much maybe what's on the slide, or maybe they don't even have slides. It's just them. And so I think it's important to recognize the role that we play in getting our work out there, getting it communicated, explaining it to others. And there's always room for refinement when it comes to that, in terms of how might I do that better. And the top tip that I have for anyone who feels uncomfortable or just wants to develop skills in this area of being able to communicate effectively and speak eloquently, like anything, the best way to get better at something is to do it. So look for opportunities to talk, period. Look for opportunities to talk about your work, especially. And this can actually start without anyone listening, or you're listening to yourself, but say it out loud. So if you're a BI analyst, you're working in dashboard land and you're thinking, well, I don't have opportunities to go talk to someone else. I'll say, one, you can create those. But before you do that, just practice talking through a dashboard aloud, because doing that, you start to land on words that will help you maybe explain or describe what you are communicating. Also forces you to weave things together and have connecting words and phrases between different views that you're looking at, which can subsequently turn into really interesting points that you may want to communicate then to someone else. So whatever you are working on, whatever you're creating, as a first step, if communicating feels uncomfortable or you want to refine it, is just to start talking to yourself aloud and listen to what you're saying, because you can hear a lot in your own voice. And it's important for this to be aloud, not in your head, because of the way we can hear things and because of the struggle we feel when we're trying to find the next word or when we're trying to explain the thing in words that make sense. And for this, you can imagine a specific audience or somebody on the other end of it who you're talking to, so that there's sort of structure to it. But say things out loud. Once you get comfortable with that, then invite somebody else to listen to those words. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about, it doesn't have to be somebody with context. It can be, and it especially can be if really what you're looking for is feedback on your delivery and not the content or not that piece of it. Then if they've got the contextual information, it can be easier to focus on delivery. Though actually, I guess you could make the same argument the other way, that someone with absolutely no clue could just kind of tune out the specifics and focus on mannerisms and tone of voice and all of these things that go into helping someone present or communicate in a way that's going to be most effective.
But pointing to those examples, I think, really calls attention to the fact that it's not just about public speaking, which I think we end up talking about as like the approximation of communication skills or presentation skills. It's the idea of, are you a good communicator? And that comes across not just in big public speaking endeavors that you are a person who does speaking for a living, but rather, how do you facilitate a good meeting? How do you run a good demo? How do you sit down and have a one-on-one requirements gathering conversation with a client to understand what it is that they need, and being able to probe and ask questions and building that toolbox of questions you can ask in addition to being able to talk through kind of what you want to present and share feels so important, and something that we gloss over a lot, because I think people think maybe that the soft skills or the communication skills aren't as important because they don't see themselves as a speaker. Whereas what you're talking about is how these skill sets are something that serve us in the
everyday, for everyone, for every interaction you ever have with another human being. Yeah. And something else that you can work on, and there's actually, I have a whole chapter devoted to this in the book, which I think many people will find surprising. I'll just flip through it so I can show it if I can get it here fast enough. Introducing yourself. Right? We all do this at some point, and it might be the formal, you're on a stage introducing yourself, but more often it's maybe you've gone to a networking thing and you need to say something quickly to the person who sat down next to you, or even just in social situations, right? How do you talk to people about the work that you do? Does that make them want to tune in or tune out? I feel like I always had job titles where the person wanted to tune out, right? Historically, I'm a credit risk management analyst. Like, okay.
Tell me more.
Yeah, but being able to introduce yourself well is a great skill, and it is something that you can pull from in so many different dimensions of your life, right? On a job interview, introducing yourself socially, as we talked about at the onset of a presentation. And so I'm not flipping well enough while I'm talking, so I'll save that for later. But the crux is it actually introducing yourself. The process is almost a case study for the rest of the content that we go through in the book, in terms of you can apply the exact same things there where it comes to planning and thinking about your audience and your message that you want to get across and what are the supporting pieces. And so actually take people through a really specific process of thinking about what are the traits that you want your audience to see in you. Right? If you do your thing, right, whether it's a business meeting or a presentation or just talking with your colleague about your work, and they are going to describe you with 5 adjectives, what do you want those to be? Right? Do you want to come across as caring and empathetic, or knowledgeable and trustworthy, or right, the list is very long. So being really specific about what are you trying to get across, and then going through your background of work experiences and projects you've worked on, jobs you've had, education, right? Whatever's going to be relevant, stories from your life that can demonstrate those, right? And then organizing that into the story of you, which you can then practice delivering and refining, and you can pull from for different things. And I actually, here, I'll show it because it was one of the things I pulled out. So I mentioned I did all of this for the case study, including going through, so I'm sort of in a character when I do the case study. It's right, it's not Cole from Storytelling with Data, it's Cole the consultant. And so I went through the process of thinking about, well, what do I want to portray in terms of traits to my audience? What experiences does this person have that might get these across? How do I organize that into a story? And so my office is littered with Post-it notes, as folks know who know me. That's one of my favorite things. But this is actually the output of my brainstorming process for giving my introduction for this Tricks case study. So here I originally started, so I wanted to be known as discerning, capable, and collaborative. So I went through an exercise like 10 minutes of writing down words and then grouping those. And that's how those came out. And then I separately brainstormed my experiences, projects, anecdotes, anything that might highlight those or be important in other ways. And then at this point now, I've organized it into a story arc. So it's sort of context over here, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. And then that's what I use as my guide then when I'm practicing speaking my introduction. And so rather than writing out any sort of a script, I have these anchors to be able to reflect back on as I'm speaking to pull in the next piece of it. And so you actually then get to see how that all comes together into an introduction, as well as into the sort of zippy sentence that I can use when I need something short.
There's a great quick question here on just how you would introduce yourself, Cole. Like if you were to give an example of how you would introduce yourself, which you did very eloquently at the beginning of our chart chat.
Well, because it wasn't the first time I've said those words, right? And that's the point of all of this. So if I'm being short, my name's Cole, and I help people make graphs that make sense. And then you can understand, so stop. And then you can figure out, depending on who I'm talking to, do I add in more than that? Do I add in less than that? Where am I? What do they care about? Oh, they're local in Milwaukee. Hey, I should mention we do workshops. We actually have our next public workshop in Milwaukee coming up at the end of the month, and some fun celebratory book stuff along with that. Do you notice how I worked that in? That was pretty good, right? Which is true. We do have a workshop in Milwaukee at the end of September, right? But then you can pull as you need to pretty seamlessly to make it work for what you need. Whether it's a brief introduction at the beginning of a video podcast or anything. And so the
Can you
process
just,
of really going through that
elaborate?
once.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you
Thank you.
elaborate on the importance of the word stop? You said, "Hi, my name's Cole," and then stop.
Because I didn't, right? I kept going. And so if I were to do it again, not if I were, I will do it again. My name's Cole, and I help people make graphs that make sense. That pause punctuates my words, right? And now you're listening because you want to understand why I paused and what I'm going to say next. Yeah.
And
so
it's
these
one
are
of
the
the
things.
hardest things to do, isn't it? And yet it's, if you stood up on a keynote stage and did that and just stopped for 3 seconds, everyone would be
Oh, I have done. I one time walked on a stage right after the person before me had everybody get out their phone and like snap some QR code, which is not how you want to go on stage as a presenter. And so I walked out and just fully stood there quietly until I had attention back, right? Smiling awkwardly at everyone in the room so that when I started, I had their attention. Mm-hmm. And these are the things that so I've had the good fortune of standing in front of hundreds, thousands of audiences over the past decade. And each opportunity to do that is another opportunity to refine and figure out how can I do it better, because you get to watch people and see how they interact, right? If somebody leans forward, or if you see sort of a softening in a positive way in an audience, I can think to myself, well, what did I just do that created that? How do I lean into that if it makes sense? Or do I want to change the mood? What does that look like? Right? Picking up nuances in terms of how does where you position yourself in the room change the dynamic, right? Are you standing? Are you sitting? Are you moving around? Are you in the back of the room sometimes, maybe even as you're speaking, so that people in different parts of the room feel equally addressed? All of this I learned through trial and error and just being the observer every single time I talked to anybody else and could get a response from that. And so that's really what I try to speed up for everybody reading in the delivery section of storytelling.
It's amazing how smartphones have become a great feedback mechanism when you're live, because when people are looking, you can see if people are looking at their phones, and that's a little indicator that perhaps that section needs some work. And sometimes when the phones come out for a photograph, you've either made a killer slide or a killer point, and so it's kind of good seeing this happen. You think,
or they realize there was no zero baseline on your y-axis, and they're just
and they're going to slightly criticize
so they can.
This Cole, this Andy Cotgreave, what do they know about database?
You're about to go viral for bad graph.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe everything I just heard, is about, when you say trial and error, you're saying, go out and do it, right? Get practice. What about developing your own style, right? I've seen, I watch other people present. I think about, some people, and we're all on different continuums. Certainly Steve and I on different continuums, the number of slides I might have in my deck and the pace that I'm going versus how somebody else is presenting. Or I think of a speaker, I went to a workshop with John Cotter, great on leadership, but, he was a very dry comment. I'd listen to him for hours, but he was a very relaxed, dry speaker that would sit on the table and, hunch over and talk very slowly, but yet you were hanging on every word the guy was saying. So, what is it? It's not just simply about the presence or just simply about your talking style, right? It's like it's a whole package, right?
It is, but that package can be made up of a ton of different things, right? There's not just one package. And that's why, the personality you described works in that case. And so I think it's great to look at other speakers, both those who do it well as those who maybe have some room for improvement, because there are things you can learn from both of those. And sometimes it's easier to pick out the critical things that someone else is doing and then think about how you might weave those in. Though recording yourself is the number one thing for getting better at looking and talking like somebody people want to watch and listen to. So definitely am a proponent of that. But look at effective people to see what did they do well, but not how do you copy that? How might you fold that into how you do things in a way that is authentic to you? Jeff, I'll often bring up a different personality when it comes to that, which is Hans Rosling. And anyone who has seen one of his, it can be any of them, the TED Talks, or I always love the short session that he did with the BBC, where he's got a bubble graph and it's moving around and he's jumping and he's talking and he's got the Swedish accent and it all works beautifully. not everyone could pull that off. Nor should they. So it definitely is about developing your own style, figuring out what works for you, and then leaning into the best pieces of that. And a great way to understand what those look like for you is just take note of yourself the next time you're talking with someone about something that excites you. What's your body language like, right? Your shoulders are back, your hands might be up, you are smiling, you're doing these things, you might get louder, or you might get soft because you're so excited. You can then weave these components into how you communicate in other settings as well.
So,
And
Cole, can I just
Andy.
interrupt? Going back to the Hans Rosling thing. So when I talk to people about how to present, I show the Hans Rosling video, and I say to people, I was like, you can all be Hans Rosling, right? I know, he was a pro. He dedicated many years to that craft, and was a but I was like, look, if you want
we're supposed to we're supposed to disagree here, right?
Well, yeah, but the thing is,
anyone can be Hans Rosling. I fully disagree with that statement.
But I did it once. Yeah, I did it at a Tableau internal event for Tableau marketers. I was like, look, if you want to drive change with data, you can be Hans Rosling. And the very next day, one of my colleagues then presented this chart, and he changed the presentation into a bouncing around, introducing thing, doing the data, and it was brilliant. Everyone was just like, "Wow, you're the best presenter we've got in marketing now." There are things I think you can pick up from Hans
Please
Rosling.
Don't take that to say, though, that anyone can try to do that and it's going to work, because that's bollocks.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm busting here with this thing because it also relates to the can anyone become great at this? Wow, and we discussed this earlier. Hold up, just give me a second with this, because we discussed this notion. Oh, I'm not naturally born. I don't have the proclivities. I'm not comfortable doing this. And I know you have a lot to say about. Well, that doesn't mean you can't be good at it. I'm thinking back also to when Joss Fong presented, and it was some of the best stuff I've ever seen. I said, I will never make something that good. And people said, no, you will. I said, no, I'm not going to make something like that. But it doesn't mean I can't be better at this. I may never be great at it, but anyone following the things that you recommend, watching how really good presenters present, I call it the meta part of the presentation. How are they presenting the presentation? You can certainly get way better at this stuff. You may never be great, but you can be a hell of a lot better.
It's just like anything, Steve. I feel like you could replace speaking with any other verb in that sentence and it would be true, right? You can think of the same with graphs. Can everyone make the most beautiful graph ever? No. Can everyone get better at how they make graphs and dashboards? Yeah, absolutely. The same is true with speaking. There is always room for marginal improvement, no matter where you are on the spectrum. And sometimes there's room for massive improvement. And I just think figuring out what you are passionate about, and if you can have that then overlap with how you practice presenting. Again, we say presenting, but to Amanda's point earlier, that doesn't mean standing on a stage. It's anytime you're communicating out loud to someone else, you are presenting, and you can use that to practice, and really being observant of where do you do that well? Where do you feel comfortable? And then how do you bring that into aspects of your work where they can work for you in useful ways? And practicing, right? Andy, you mentioned before that pausing on the stage is hard. Well, yeah, it's really hard the first time. It's a little less hard the second time. You learn tricks, right? All right, I'm going to count slowly to 20, and it's going to be painful, but I'm going to stand here with a smile on my face while I do it, and hopefully that makes it a little less awkward for everybody watching.
It's a win-win.
And then over time, it gets comfortable.
Yeah, it's a win-win because it makes you sound profound, but it also gives you time to think about what it is you've got to say next, and
be more eloquent subsequently as a result.
Yeah.
And then, it changes the way I speak differently today than I did 10 years ago, irrespective of who I'm talking to, because of the time and attention I've put to how I speak. You can hear this, and I didn't even realize it. It was listening back to a podcast or a video or something recently, where it's this very pronounced cadence of pausing and letting points sink in, and then going, and then the ebbs and the flows, which is a highly trained thing, right? I didn't used to do that. I used to be the shaking leaf behind the computer. And so I think, just going back to where we started this vein of the conversation, that if I can make myself into somebody that people will listen to and maybe hopefully enjoy listening to, then anyone can, because none of this felt natural to me.
Yeah.
This
I hate
was
to cut
learning
us
by
off, but
doing and refining.
we're at the hour. I'm sure we could go another
Yeah,
hour
that went by
talking about
fast.
all
I knew
of
it
this,
would.
but we are
But we
gonna
won't.
continue in the after party. So please join us in the after party. So I think this was a wonderful dialogue that we can continue. For information about the Big Book of Dashboards, the chart chat recordings, they're on YouTube. You can check out bigbookofdashboards.com. Cole, her new book, Storytelling with You. There's a QR code for you. This is the time to pick up your phone and scan. You can do that now.
Yes,
Scan
now
your
would be an
QR
appropriate
code.
time for that.
That would be perfect. And pre-order that on Amazon. The Milwaukee and London workshops coming up. So if you're in that area, check those out. More information there. And Amanda, real quick, do you want to plug the Information is
Sure.
Beautiful Awards?
The Information is Beautiful Awards are back after a 2-year pandemic pause, and DVS is organizing and running them. So we hope that all of you amazing data viz creators will go ahead and submit your work for consideration. If you submit for a category award, you also get considered for some of the individual special awards, and you can find more information on the Information is Beautiful Awards website. And second, just as a quick plug too, if you're someone who is more of a data viz creator behind the scenes or at work or in other spaces and do data viz for your job, our annual State of the Industry survey is open for this month, accepting responses. We would love to have your insights added there. And if you need to be convinced, there's a great article on Nightingale right now addressing some common questions about why we think that the Data Visualization Society's State of the Industry survey adds value and is useful. So thanks for your time if you're choosing to fill it out.
That's great. And our next chart chat is scheduled for October 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern. You can get details on that at this link, bigpic.me cc34. We'll put that link in the chat window. And I guess that puts us at time. Thank you all for joining us and being part of Chart Chat. And please join us for the after party. We'll stop there and join you over on Zoom.
Thanks
Bye,
so much.
everyone.
Thanks for your time today, Cole.
Bye,
Thanks for joining
everybody.
us for Chart Chat.
Thank you, everybody.
Hey, everybody.
Bye now.
You're the after party.